A young girl places a plant into a bowl of milk, and to her amazement, the plant immediately unfurls and, nourished by the milk, emits a contented sigh. Moments later, her mother's health begins to improve rapidly. This is when Ofelia realizes that the magic from fairy tales might just be real. Just days ago, Ofelia was an ordinary girl. Her mother, heavily pregnant and enduring discomfort, had moved her to Captain Vidal's military camp. Vidal insisted his child be born near him. As her mother stopped the car to vomit on the way, Ofelia noticed a broken stone statue by the roadside. She picked up a stray stone and tried fitting it back onto the statue. To her surprise, the next moment, a large praying mantis crawled out of the statue's mouth, looking exactly like a fairy from her storybooks. To her mother, however, this was nothing but another of Ophelia's silly fantasies. Her priority was ensuring they didn't keep Vidal waiting. True to form, Vidal was displeased when they arrived a few minutes late. Still, for the sake of his unborn child, he forced a welcoming smile and instructed the housekeeper, Mercedes, to help settle the mother and daughter. Ophelia's mother was in poor condition, and the doctor had to rely on sedatives to help her sleep. Worried about her mother's health and uneasy in this unfamiliar environment, Ofelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her instincts proved correct. This seemingly peaceful military camp was, in truth, a base of brutal repression. Vidal was consumed by his mission to crush the nearby guerrilla forces hiding in the forest. To this end, he imposed strict rationing to deprive the rebels of any supplies. Yet, somehow, the guerrillas managed to endure. On her very first night there, Ofelia stumbled upon the secret. She saw the doctor discreetly hand Mercedes a package. Kind-hearted by nature, Ofelia chose not to expose them. She believed both Mercedes and the doctor were good people. Later, as her mother slept soundly under the influence of the medication, Ofelia made another startling discovery. The praying mantis she'd seen earlier had followed her to the camp. It crawled right up to her. Ofelia found the fairy in her storybook and showed it to the praying mantis. To her amazement, the next moment, the mantis transformed into an identical fairy from the illustration and motioned for Ofelia to follow it. Guided by the fairy, Ofelia ventured into the labyrinth in the courtyard. As she walked, the path opened up to reveal a deep well at the center. Descending the spiral staircase, she quickly reached the bottom, where she encountered the fawn for the first time. The fawn was delighted to see Ofelia. It opened a box, releasing several fairies as a welcome. It introduced itself as the fawn from ancient tales and revealed a shocking truth. Ofelia was the princess of the underworld, who had long ago escaped to the human world and lost her way. To bring her back, the king of the underworld created a gateway in this very labyrinth. Ofelia was skeptical until the fawn pointed out the crescent-shaped birthmark on her shoulder as proof. However, before she could return to her realm, she had to complete 3 tasks to demonstrate that she had not lost her true essence. The fawn handed her a magical book, explaining that it would reveal her tasks. But when she opened it, all the pages were blank. Before she could ask, the fawn vanished. At home, Ofelia was lost in thought, even uninterested in the beautiful new dress her mother had prepared for her. Later, while bathing alone, she gathered the courage to reopen the book. To her amazement, the blank pages now displayed instructions, and seeing the crescent birthmark on her shoulder confirmed her identity as the lost princess. Overjoyed, Ofelia confided in Mercedes about her encounter with the fairy and the fawn. Though Mercedes didn't believe in such creatures, she didn't scold Ofelia for indulging in fantasy. She simply warned her that fawns were not always benevolent. Their conversation was cut short when Vidal summoned Mercedes. In the storeroom, new supplies had arrived, and Vidal, determined to secure everything, confiscated Mercedes' key. However, during a patrol in the mountains, he discovered a bottle of antibiotics near a rebel campsite. This led him to suspect someone within the camp was aiding the guerrillas. Meanwhile, Ofelia ventured alone into the forest, following the book's guidance to a withered fig tree. According to the book, a giant toad lived in its roots, and if she could place a magical stone into its stomach, she would retrieve a golden key from within. Not wanting to soil her new dress, Ofelia hung it on a branch before crawling into the tree's hollow. Inside, she found a damp, dark, and slimy tunnel teeming with grotesque bugs. Terrified, she pressed on, determined to complete her task. At the deepest part of the hollow, she encountered the enormous toad. When Ofelia invoked her status as a princess and commanded it to comply, the toad roared in defiance. Then she noticed the toad's gluttonous behavior. Her hand full of bugs made its mouth water. Ofelia cleverly mixed the bugs with the magical stone and tempted the toad into swallowing it. What happened next was both horrifying and grotesque. The toad vomited up its entire stomach, and inside was the golden key. As she emerged from the hollow, the sky had turned dark. Ofelia discovered her new dress had been blown into the mud by the wind. Furious at the ruined dress, her mother scolded her harshly and punished her by forbidding her from eating dinner. Yet, Ofelia didn't mind at all. She was ecstatic about completing her first task. The fawn was delighted that Ofelia had retrieved the golden key. It then handed her a piece of chalk and told her that as long as she completed the remaining 2 tasks before the full moon, she could return to the underworld as a princess. However, back at home, when Ofelia reopened the magical book, it no longer showed instructions. Instead, the pages were stained with blood. A sense of dread filled her heart. Rushing to her mother's room, she opened the door to find her mother bleeding profusely. Terrified, she screamed for Vidal. The doctor declared that the woman needed complete bed rest. To avoid disturbing his wife, Captain Vidal forcibly separated Ofelia from her mother, while spending time alone with Mercedes. Ofelia confided that she already knew Mercedes' secret but promised not to tell Vidal, as she didn't want Mercedes to get hurt. Ophelia's kindness moved Mercedes deeply. Gently, she sang a lullaby to comfort the girl's fragile heart. Later that night, Mercedes sneaked into the forest with the doctor. It turned out that the leader of the guerrilla group was her brother. She handed him a copied key to the storeroom and urged him to be extra cautious. After Mercedes left, the fawn appeared in Ophelia's room and chastised her for failing to complete the tasks on time. Learning that her mother's illness had delayed her progress, the fawn took out a mandrake root and instructed Ofelia to submerge it in fresh milk and place it under her mother's bed. It promised this would quickly improve her mother's condition. The fawn then warned her that the next task was very dangerous and came with one strict rule: she must not eat anything inside the task's location, or the consequences would be dire. Ofelia solemnly agreed. She went to her mother's room, following the fawn's instructions by soaking the mandrake in milk and placing it beneath the bed. Then, she opened the magical book, which revealed guidance for her second task. Following the directions, Ofelia used the chalk to draw a small door on the wall. To her astonishment, the chalk-drawn door opened, revealing the entrance to her next challenge. Inside was what appeared to be an underground palace. Before entering, Ofelia flipped an hourglass, reminding herself to return before the sand ran out. She soon found herself in a grand hall, at the center of which stood a massive table laden with sumptuous food. Hungry and drawn to the feast, at the far end of the table sat a strange, motionless creature. Relieved that it didn't react to her presence, Ofelia noticed something unsettling: a pile of shoes on the floor. Could they have belonged to its victims? Terrified, she released the fairies from her box. Guided by them, she located 3 cabinets. Using the golden key, she opened the leftmost one and retrieved a sharp dagger from inside. The task was complete. Far easier than she had expected. The fairies urged her to leave immediately. However, seeing the creature still unmoving, Ofelia let her guard down. As she passed by the table, the food tempted her once again. The grapes, in particular, seemed to hold a magical allure. Ignoring the fawn's warning, she plucked one and popped it into her mouth. She failed to notice the creature's hands suddenly moving behind her, placing its eyeballs into the sockets on its palms. The creature raised its hands and saw Ofelia stealing the food. It began to move toward her, still oblivious. Ofelia was jolted into panic when she saw the monster devour several fairies that tried to stop it. Horrified, she turned to flee. However, her delay had caused the hourglass to run out. The door through which she had entered was now sealed shut. She desperately pushed against it, but it wouldn't budge. With the creature closing in, Ofelia frantically drew another door with the chalk. The chalk broke mid-drawing. The creature lunged at her. In desperation, she climbed onto a chair and quickly drew a door on the ceiling. This time, the chalk worked. Pushing the door open, she narrowly escaped, slamming it shut just as the creature reached her. Safe in her room but shaken, Ofelia mourned the loss of the fairies who had died because of her mistake. After calming herself, she returned to her mother's room. To her relief, her mother's fever had broken, and she was now peacefully asleep. Even the doctor couldn't explain the sudden improvement. Vidal, however, remained cautious. He instructed the doctor that if complications arose, he must prioritize saving the unborn child over the mother. Hiding under the bed, Ofelia overheard this and became even more worried for her mother. Meanwhile, Vidal received urgent news a supply train a few kilometers away had been blown up by the guerrilla forces. Strangely, none of the cargo had been taken. As Captain Vidal puzzled over the guerrillas' motives, flames erupted in the direction of the military camp. It was a trap. The guerrillas had used the train explosion to lure Vidal and his troops away, launching a surprise attack on the camp in their absence. By the time Vidal and his men returned, it was too late. The storeroom had been emptied of supplies. One detail caught Vidal's attention. The lock on the storeroom door had been opened with a key, not forced. There was no time to dwell on it, as Vidal quickly led his cavalry in pursuit of the fleeing guerrillas. Outnumbering them, his troops easily wiped out the decoy force and even managed to capture one of the rebels alive. Mercedes was filled with dread when she learned of the capture. She knew Vidal would stop at nothing, using the most brutal torture methods to extract information from the prisoner. Helpless, she discreetly hid a small knife on her person, preparing for the worst. The night stretched on endlessly. The captured rebel endured unspeakable torment at Vidal's hands. While in Ophelia's room, the fawn appeared once more. Seeing that most of the fairies had been lost, the fawn flew into a rage. It declared that Ofelia had failed her tasks and forfeited her chance to return to the underworld.
Vuestro espíritu se quedará para siempre entre los hombres. Envejeceréis con ellos, moriréis como ellos. Vuestra memoria se desvanecerá en el tiempo.
As the fawn vanished, Ofelia was left overwhelmed with regret and despair. At the break of dawn, Vidal summoned the doctor, ordering him to patch up the prisoner so he wouldn't die before revealing vital information. The sight of the man, now disfigured and begging the doctor to end his suffering, tore at the doctor's heart. While tending to the man's wounds, Vidal noticed a tube of antibiotics in the doctor's medical kit. Suspicious, he returned to his quarters and compared it to the bottle he had found in the forest. They were identical. The captain immediately realized that the doctor was the traitor, just as he grabbed his pistol to settle the score. A noise from his wife's room caught his attention. It turned out that Ofelia had secretly come to change the milk for Mandrake. While she was speaking to the humanoid root, Vidal dragged her out from under the bed. The next moment, he spotted the strange roots beneath the bed. The captain assumed Ofelia was engaging in witchcraft and prepared to teach her a harsh lesson. Fortunately, his wife woke up in time to stop him. However, she too refused to believe Ofelia, dismissing the idea that the root could heal her as nonsense. Determined to keep Ofelia grounded in reality, she threw the mandrake into the fire. As the mandrake let out a painful cry, the wife suddenly clutched her stomach in excruciating pain. Seeing this, Ofelia shouted for help. However, the captain had already returned to the interrogation room. Upon discovering that the doctor had mercifully ended a man's suffering, Vidal shot him dead on the spot. The next moment, he received devastating news his wife was in labor, but the only doctor was already dead, leaving the captain no choice but to summon a nurse for the delivery. In the end, the baby was born, but the mother passed away. Ophelia's worst fear had come true. Vidal got the son he had always longed for, but Ofelia lost the only family she had left. After the funeral, Vidal placed the baby in his room under Mercedes' care, but once the baby was asleep, Vidal detained Mercedes, revealing that the dying man had confessed there was indeed a traitor in the camp. Though his words were vague, Mercedes realized she was in danger. The place was no longer safe for her. She quickly packed her things, stopping by Ophelia's room for a final goodbye before escaping. To her surprise, Ofelia begged to go with her. Unable to leave the girl behind, Mercedes reluctantly agreed. Through pouring rain, the two fled toward the forest, but when Mercedes turned back, she saw Vidal's cold, merciless face behind them. He had anticipated Mercedes' escape, though he hadn't expected Ofelia to be involved. Learning that Ofelia had kept the secret from him, Vidal slapped her and locked her away. His priority now was interrogating Mercedes. While selecting his torture tools, Mercedes retrieved a hidden knife and quietly cut through the ropes binding her wrists. She stabbed Vidal in the back and then plunged the blade into his chest. As Vidal tried to speak, she thrust the knife into his mouth. Taking the opportunity, Mercedes escaped the interrogation room, but she hadn't gone far when Vidal, bloodied and enraged, pursued her, shouting for his men to capture her. A group of soldiers quickly caught up with her on the mountain. Despite Mercedes' desperate attempts to flee, she couldn't outrun the mounted troops. Surrounded, Mercedes raised the knife to her neck, ready to end her life rather than be taken. Suddenly, the soldiers fell one by one, struck by gunfire. Within moments, they were wiped out. It turned out that his younger brother had arrived with a large group of people in time to save Mercedes's life. At this point, Ofelia still has no idea what is going on outside. Just as she is about to lose all hope, the fawn reappears and gives her one last chance. She just has to bring her brother into the labyrinth, and she will not be asked any more questions, but her brother is in Vital's room. So Ofelia sneaks in using the chalk, while the captain is bandaging himself. She quickly grabs her brother and flees, but just as she descended the stairs, Vidal caught her. He chased her out of the house, only to find the resistance forces had already overrun the area. However, retrieving his son was his top priority, so he pursued Ofelia into the labyrinth. Panicked, Ofelia ran aimlessly, nearly losing her way until a wall behind her opened, revealing the correct path. When Vidal caught up, Ofelia had vanished, forcing him to retreat and search elsewhere. Ofelia, meanwhile, reached the fawn. She was about to hand over the baby when she noticed the fawn holding a dagger. Suspicious, she demanded to know what it was for. The fawn explained that the baby's blood was the key to opening the labyrinth, and only a single drop was needed. Despite its reassurances, Ofelia refused to trust it. Clutching the baby tightly, she refused to let go. Enraging the fawn,
¿Sacrificaréis vuestro derecho sagrado por este mocoso al que apenas conocéis?
Sí, lo sacrifico.
At that moment, Vidal arrived. Unable to see the fawn, he only saw Ofelia cradling the baby and talking to herself. Mistaking her actions as a threat to his son, Vidal snatched the baby away and shot Ofelia without hesitation. Leaving her to die on the cold ground, Vidal walked out of the labyrinth, only to find himself surrounded by the resistance forces. Realizing his defeat, he handed the baby over to Mercedes before his life was ended.
Decidle a qué hora murió su padre. Decidle que yo...
Ni siquiera sabrá tu nombre.
Mercedes hurried to find Ofelia, only to discover her lying in a pool of blood. Her small life was extinguished, leaving Mercedes heartbroken. In her final moments, Mercedes sang a lullaby to comfort Ofelia, but what she didn't know was that Ophelia's blood had seeped into the well, opening the gate to the underworld. In the next moment, she found herself back in the warm embrace of the underworld. Dressed in a stunning royal gown, her father, seated on the throne, told her that it was her refusal to sacrifice her brother that allowed her to complete the final task. This test, he explained, was one of kindness and compassion. Her mother, healthy and whole, sat lovingly on her own throne, beckoning Ofelia to reclaim her rightful place. The chamber erupted into thunderous applause as the princess was finally welcomed home. In her final moments, Ofelia smiled with genuine joy. This sight was too much for Mercedes, who broke down in uncontrollable sobs. It remains unclear whether this ending was real or merely Ophelia's imagination. In the director's ultimate vision, the princess returned to her kingdom, ruling the underworld for centuries with her kind and loving heart, earning the adoration of all her subjects.